We're into round 4 of Norway Chess, and I want to show you the game between the world's number 1, Magnus Carlsen, and Arjun Erigaisi, who is rising fast. He loves sharp positions, so how would Carlsen manage this tricky encounter? Before we get into the game, just want to mention again that I'm giving a broadcast tonight, 7 p.m. UK time, for patrons only. Patrons only masterclass. I'm going to be covering calculation. So if you're interested, then do subscribe to patreon.com/PowerPlayChess and enjoy lots of benefits. Okay, here we go. Carlsen with white, c4. Yeah, we don't see that so often from Magnus, actually. Interesting. So he obviously hit upon something in Arjun's play that he thought, well, okay, this might be worth a twist. Okay, here we go. So symmetrical English, and one can play this in many ways for white. E3, D3, knight F3, E4, rook B1. Very flexible move. White isn't committing the centre pawns yet. And obviously the plan is to play A3 and B4. It's interesting, when I looked at the stats of this, you'll find that white actually scores very well in practice. And I think one of the reasons is that it puts a little bit of doubt in black's mind that, white isn't committing yet in the centre. So, black has to decide on whether to play E5 or E6 or knight F6. It's not so easy. So knight F6. And Arjun spent over 5 minutes on that move, which shows that, he was... Well, when I looked, he'd never played this exact position before. So he's kind of improvising. You have to feel your way through, and I think that's a kind of situation that Magnus enjoys. A3. Of course, threatening to play B4. And Arjun decides to just clamp down on that, preventing it. But, of course, that leaves some weakened squares here. So D3 after 13 minutes by Magnus, actually. That's kind of interesting. So, yeah, he wasn't sure himself. You can play this in different ways. You can go E4, you can go E3. But he decides on D3. And E6 from Arjun. Well, I have to say, this looks a little bit funny to me. It's kind of an odd array of pawns, and, these squares look a bit funny to me. I would have thought just castles, maintaining flexibility in the middle, but okay. E6. Knight F3 from Carlsen. And if D5, I wonder whether Arjun was toying with this. Then, after bishop F4, I feel that, these bishops have real potential, actually. And, possibly Knight E5 coming. In combination with the fact that these squares are a bit weak. I think white is doing quite well there. So anyway, castles, bishop E3, and this is an unusual way to play. And knight A4. So looking perhaps to get in on, well, B6 in this case. So C5 is attacked, so D6 and castles. Rook B8 preempts knight B6. Knight B6 is possible. One could take this bishop. I suppose it does straighten out black's pieces. Black would be very well coordinated then. But that's a possible way of playing. But instead, Carlsen, after 7 minutes, goes for D4. A little later on in the game, he was saying that he thought his moves were fine, but he felt as though he was playing a bit indecisively. And looking at the clock times, he spent 7 minutes over knight F3, 5 minutes over bishop E3, 9 minutes over knight A4, and again a further 7 minutes over this move. That is quite unusual for Magnus. He usually doesn't burn up so much time. At this point, Arjun exchanged on D4. You don't have to play like that. One could hold the tension with b6, but c takes. And I think after this exchange, Magnus would have been pretty happy, because you can see that white has a little bit of a space advantage. White pieces look pretty good, but Arjun was hoping to counter that with b5. But again, I think this is quite pleasant for white now, because the pieces are so active. And queen a4, yeah, you can see white is very well coordinated. The rooks are connected. All white's pieces are playing. And actually, straight away, that threat to the a-pawn is a little bit uncomfortable for black, actually, because, well, for example, if black tries to defend it, queen c7 doesn't look great, the queen gets hit again. Or queen d8, bishop a7, that's very unfortunate. The rook is actually trapped. So Arjun has to cast around for compensation. One could push in the middle, but, you know, this square is now weakened. You know, that's not so simple. And the bishop is now blocked. So Arjun decides on bishop b7. So at least he connects his rooks, but this gives up the pawn on a5. So what compensation does black have? Well, basically center pawns. And they start to roll down the board. But, and you know, in other circumstances, those pawns could give black pretty good compensation, but Carlsen's forces are so well coordinated that actually he can cope with this pretty well. Bishop g5. So straight away, there's pressure here. d4. Okay, that's exchanged on f6, and knight d5. Bishop g5 played. And here's a solid move. This knight is removed from the middle. Knight b4. And solidly protected. That's what knights need. They need to be protected by pawns on solid outposts. And it blocks the b file. So Carlsen's queenside is secure. And that means that he can easily switch that rook, for example, to the center to control any pawn advance in the middle. I mean, obviously that isn't possible at the moment anyway, because the bishop is on prise, but you can see that, yeah, with rook d1, basically white is completely secure. And then you can slowly start to try and convert that extra pawn. So Arjun plays bishop d2. So he's looking to get that pawn back. Well, he can't win a pawn back, but he can simplify down into a major piece endgame. And yes, getting rid of the minor pieces, major piece endgame, does increase black's drawing chances. Rook d1. You often find, for example, in the rook and pawn endgame, you know, a pawn down, you can still draw that. So we've got simplification. Interesting, Carlsen does not go for queen takes d4, because then rook e2. And you can see, yeah, that's a rook and pawn endgame, which would be tenable for black, because that pawn is in trouble. So Carlsen goes for queen f4, and then takes on d4 with the rook. So Carlsen is hoping to keep the queens on the board, and that'll give him chances to perhaps turn to attack black's king. That's one thing. Queen b7 played. That's not bad. The computer prefers queen b3, but you know, this is still quite tricky. Queen b7, but queen f6, you can see Carlsen looking to play actively, potentially looking at rook d8. Well, rook d1 and then rook d8 would be good. And this is where Carlsen went into the confessional booth and talked about his indecision earlier in the game. But also he thought, okay, this is a crucial moment where Erigaisi can give himself a chance to hold the game. So, okay, I think we need a think and drink moment. If you were playing black, how would you play here? What is the move that Carlsen identified as giving black the best possible drawing chances? Okay, cheers. So rook e6 played, but Carlsen was more concerned about queen e7. So because of the threat to the b pawn, then Carlsen really has to exchange queens. Now, if this were a single rook endgame, let's remove those two rooks from the board, then I would say this is a winning position for white with the rook behind the pawn. This is a well-known type of position. Very good winning chances for white. I would say it's a winning position. But with two rooks on the board, now this is much trickier because black can tie both rooks to defending that pawn. And it's not so easy to make progress. The only way really to make progress is to try and bring the king across to defend that pawn and then activate one of the rooks and hope perhaps to exchange off one of the rooks. But, this is not a simple procedure at all. But instead, rook e6 played. And that allowed Carlsen to exchange a pair of rooks. So remember, if queens are exchanged now, then the single rook endgame with the rook behind the pawn gives white very good chances. And also, as Carlsen mentioned, if the rooks are exchanged, then the queen endgame with this extra pawn also gives white good chances. So let's see what happened. Queen d4 check and b4. There we go. So Carlsen's really achieved a lot over the past few moves with that exchange. h5. Yeah, can be useful to give the king a square, and maybe there's counterplay with h4. b5, the pawn chugs on. Now, it's possible just to hold that pawn with something like queen e5 or queen c5. Still not easy to make progress there, but Carlsen, after 5 minutes thought, hits upon a very concrete continuation. Very principled move, actually. Rook e1. So he's taking the opportunity to attack the king straight away. Obviously, rook takes pawn will be met by rook e8 and mate on the next turn. So queen b8 necessary, and Carlsen has calculated this little exchange. So obviously he realised that was going to happen after rook e1, and this gives him what he wants. So this queen and pawn endgame, where the king is reasonably secure, the queen is able to hold pawns on the king side, and then just attempt to promote the pawn. In the meantime, white's king is going to be checked all over the place, but it should be able to wander over towards the queen and the pawn and find some safety there. Now, by this stage, Carlsen had caught up basically all the time. And, yeah, Arjun was under pressure here on the board and on the clock. He played queen e1 check. I mean, h4 would perhaps have been a bit of a randomizer, so Carlsen would have to think, do I allow this? Do I take this? And that exposes the king a little bit more. Still should be winning for white, but maybe more complicated. But queen e1 played. And at this point, well, Arjun, here's move 40. So, 15 minutes added on the... 30 seconds added on the clock. for each move. Increment kicks in at this point. But, Arjun was way down on time by this point. It's very tough. And he started checking randomly. And the problem is that the king just staggers up the board. And this is really where the king wants to go. And this is a losing position for black. But somehow this makes life easy. H4 from Carlsen, that's a very cool move. Just saying to black, okay, what do you got? And not a lot is the answer. There isn't anything. Queen c5, just making room for the b pawn to advance. And here, Arjun Erigaisi resigned. You can see the king is completely safe now that it's come over towards the queen and the pawn. The pawn is going to advance. And yeah, that's the end of that, basically. I thought it was very clever the way Carlsen steered the game from the opening into his kind of position. We've seen that Arjun prefers, wild complications is often how he wins games. Really complicated positions. And he thrives on the calculation. But somehow in this game, Carlsen from very early on managed to create a situation where this is all about judgment, actually. There wasn't a huge amount of very complex calculation in this game. It was about judging different kind of positions. And I think move 30 is a very clear indication of that, where this showed that Arjun's technique is not as good as it could be. Queen e7 exchanging queens would still give him a chance to hold the game. But Arjun got it wrong at this point and played rook e6. And, well, I'm not saying this was an easy victory, but Carlsen's technique is absolutely superb. He makes it look easy. That's a distinction. So that means that after 4 rounds, Magnus Carlsen leads the tournament with 8 points. Remember, it's 3 for a win in classical. Fabiano Caruana drew his round 4 game and he has 7 points. Then Hikaru Nakamura 5.5, Gukesh 4.5, Erigaisi 4.5, and Wei Yi 4. So Friday is a free day in Norway Chess. Hope you're enjoying the coverage. I do give bonus videos on my Patreon page, so do sign up if you're interested in extra content. And remember, there is the live broadcast tonight, masterclass on calculation, again for Patreon subscribers only. Thanks for watching.